From 12 News, this is Newsmakers.
The State of the State is the biggest moment on the political calendar for any governor. Dan McKee used this week's address to tout successes on education and the economy and to make the case that he's tackling challenges like the Washington Bridge and homelessness. 2 days later, McKee unveiled a budget bill designed to close the biggest deficit in years. Will lawmakers go along, and what did the big speech tell us about McKee's political future? This week on Newsmakers, we'll break it down with a reporters roundtable. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White alongside 12 News politics editor Ted Nesi. For this reporters roundtable, we welcome back from the Providence Journal Patrick Anderson and Steph Machado from the Boston Globe. Hello, everybody. You survived budget week.
Yes. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Let's go around the table. Start with you, Ted. Budget proposal, we were all briefed. Reporters were briefed on Thursday. We're taping this on a Friday morning. Over an hour briefing, got into the numbers. What stood out to you about the proposal?
I guess first and foremost, just that we've had so much, as you've called it, Tim, sky is falling rhetoric about the state's budget deficit. Joe Shekarchi's told everyone in the state that there's no money, and then in the end, they went from originally saying there might be a $400 million deficit to like $222. I don't want to say that's nothing, but it's a pretty manageable deficit, and it's frankly kind of normal in low growth blue states that don't, that just their budgets are always messed up. And so, I know it was painful for the governor's team to make the cuts they're making here and make the decisions they made, but it also doesn't feel like it was nearly as dramatic of a budget as they might have been suggesting it was going to be.
Well, it probably felt worse because of all the COVID money that has evaporated. All right, Patrick, what stood out?
Yeah, it didn't feel like a cut budget. It didn't feel like a recession budget or a real pain budget. What it felt like was a return to kind of the way things were. Gravity now applies again fiscally to the state. And there weren't those kind of election year tax cuts or new programs or goodies or things that kind of titillate or might be really exciting to the voters. It was more spinach, and we're going to have to be more prudent and practical and spend within our means kind of stuff. More fees, DMV stuff, which no one particularly likes, but are the kind of things that they use to plug those holes. So it felt like we're kind of getting back to that business as usual.
Patrick Anderson has labeled it the Brussels sprouts budget. All right, Steph, what stood out to you?
I totally agree with Patrick, but to give a specific item that I was surprised about when I was reading the budget was the new fees on electric vehicles. And apparently it is something that other states do, but they're pretty high, $300 to register your car for 2 years if you have an electric vehicle, and half of that if it's a plug-in hybrid. And we've just been hearing for years and years continued incentives for people to buy electric vehicles so that it will be less expensive to own, tax credits and things like that. So it's just a surprising thing to read in a Democratic governor's budget, even though it is something that's done in other states. All
right, I want to zoom out on the budget over the years, and I want to bring up a chart that was in your article on WPRI.com, Ted, and this is the state budget from fiscal 2019 to this week's proposal. And the first thing to note is the budget has grown. You can see in fiscal 21, that's that third one down there. That dark blue is federal spending, so that's a COVID money spike. But despite federal money receding, the state portion has continued to mushroom. Not exactly belt tightening, Ted. What's driving this?
Well, they had, I give credit to the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council think tank. They put out a really good report last week that answered some of the questions I've had, which is we have had a big bout in inflation, and so the cost of everything's gone up. We all know that in our own lives. Same goes for state governments. So you'd expect some growth just from costs rising. But RIPEC found that state leaders have added quite a lot of spending on top of what they would have had to do just to keep up with the rising cost of living there. And so I think in some ways I feel like the federal COVID money making the budget get so big so fast kind of also allowed the General Assembly to add a lot more state-funded spending without quite as much attention on it as there would have been otherwise, because the other side of the budget had grown even more. And so long story short, that state comes out of this pandemic era with this huge influx of cash. seemingly very much right back where it started, which is just revenue that does not go up as fast as the programs the state has committed itself to, and deficits as far as the eye can see.
And they keep saying, Ted, pandemic money is over. We have to get back to normal. But there's still $450 million in COVID money in this budget, right?
Yes, that's right. They haven't spent it all. In fact, it's kind of funny. I was thinking about it last night as we prepare for the presidential transition. Joe Biden, his first that COVID money is Joe Biden COVID money. That's the American Rescue Plan Act, March 2021. Joe Biden's about to leave office, and 40% of what Rhode Island got from that is going to be spent during Donald Trump's presidency. Donald Trump will get to do the ribbon cuttings if he wants to come to Rhode Island. I don't know if he will, but
Hey, Patrick, just to wrap up this part of the conversation here, when COVID money was here, they were all like one-time spending, one-time spending, one-time spending kind of stuff. Does the increase in state spending show that maybe a lot of that wasn't one-time spending, and now they have to use state money to backfill the federal?
They said that, and they did some of that. They followed what they said to a large degree, but then as the years went on, the temptation just got too much, because there are always holes, there are always gaps to fill. Healthcare, hospitals, public transportation, homelessness, there are all these things where there were gaps, and when push came to shove, they used that money. They dipped into it. It was sitting there. It was just too attractive to let go. And so they used it to fill those budget gaps in a lot of areas, a lot of nonprofits, just all kinds of little things all over the economy. And now that has gone away, and you're seeing these tough decisions, as they call them, pop up.
And you said the thing there that we really should drill down on, which is healthcare. We talk about the budget, but we almost should have two different conversations: the healthcare budget and the everything else budget, because healthcare spending and the programs similar to healthcare are going up over 5% a year. That's more than double how much state tax revenue goes up a year, and it's already the largest part of the budget. So I picture it like Pac-Man, and the healthcare part of the budget is just slowly eating the rest of the budget, a little more each year. And so again, that's, I think, to Patrick's point, that's part of why there was this desire to shovel more of the money that was available when the COVID money was around toward that, because the hospitals are saying, we're struggling even with all the funds you've given us, and we need more, and we need more.
I was confused. I'm glad you brought that up, because hospitals are already crying foul over this budget. The Hospital Association of Rhode Island put out a statement yesterday that said, quote, "The governor's budget proposal will only make a bad healthcare situation worse for Rhode Islanders." How much are they getting pinched here?
So I asked them last night. They said they calculated, I believe, a $28 million reduction because they weren't going to get the full amount of rate increases they expected, and then a monkeying with how the hospital license fee, how the taxing is done of them, that they said will cost them $18 million. I'm not going to claim I have been able to go deep enough. Maybe you guys know.
I think getting up to the 2028 that's a little in the eye of the beholder, but it's at least probably 17, 18 that they were getting last year that they're not getting. And this comes with the Prospect Medical thing. There's a question right now, even outside of the budget, of whether all of the hospitals in the state, the inpatient hospitals, are financially viable, even before any cuts.
In fact, I saw Attorney General Nerona walking out of the state while I was waiting to do the late newscast, and he said he'd just been upstairs talking to lawmakers about the fact that they might need to shovel more money into the two Prospect hospitals. Don't forget, that's exactly what Governor Healy just had to do to save the Stewart hospitals. Very similar situation.
All right, we're going to take a break here on Newsmakers. When we come back, truck tolls are returning. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers.
Follow up on the truck tolls. Is there anything being done in the budget to protect the local trucking companies that are going to be impacted?
So the cap is, as you know, was ruled unconstitutional. We do not have anything in the budget on that. This gives flexibility when DOT is working on tolling rates.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White alongside 12 News Politics editor Ted Nesi for this Reporters Roundtable on the governor's budget. We have Patrick Anderson from the Providence Journal and Steph Machado from the Boston Globe. We heard there a question from our friend at the Globe, Ed Fitzpatrick, asking about the truck tolls, everybody, and how there won't be any carve-outs for the local companies as there was before because of a First Circuit decision there. But in Brian Daniels' answer, and he's sort of the state budget guru, the head of management and budget, it made it sound like, first, that they are going to maybe lower the tolls, Patrick, but also if they're allocating $10 million a year, that suggests the tolls will be open by, say, the fourth quarter, right?
Yeah, probably. I think the headline is the tolls are coming back, which we kind of knew. But McKee specifically, I think, is punting a little bit, both from a legal perspective. I think they're still trying to figure out what they can get away with and what will be legal, but also just moving this one to the legislature, who will probably make the decision on what to do, whether they can do something new to help the local trucking industry or just lower the rate. But yeah, they were making about a little more than 40 million a year from the truck tolls. So that would suggest about a quarter of the.
So a tolling hot potato, here you go, General Assembly, you can have it.
Right. Or maybe maybe they come up with something that makes it more palatable to the local industry that hadn't been thought of before.
And if I remember, Patrick, didn't it, DOT sets the rates? It's not in the law, right? I think DOT.
I think that's right.
Does that sound right? Yeah.
Yes.
I don't remember, but they could put it in the law if they wanted to.
They could do that too.
That's true. All right, Steph, always a big ticket item is education. There are winners and losers in every budget, and that was the case with education funding with the governor, right?
Yeah, so the governor did put $40 million more into sending to public schools than he did last year. But, this is all part of this complex formula, and enrollment is a huge factor in the formula. So some districts that lost enrollment did get a cut, which is masked when you talk about the overall increase, right? And then some districts got an increase. One thing that he did do this year is he increased the poverty factor in the formula. So districts that have a high number of students in poverty, Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, Woonsocket, and Newport all are getting an extra boost this year on top of what they would normally get from the formula. So that was a change he's proposing to make.
All right. And Patrick, on homelessness, which has been just driving the news cycle this past week, there are plans in the governor's budget for an increase in taxes on home sales valued at over $800,000. And also whole house short-term rentals, Airbnbs, a 5% hotel tax. And that money, I guess, would be earmarked toward homelessness. Does that offset the loss in federal funding for homelessness in this budget?
Not entirely. There's going to be a cut to some degree. I was not able to get a final number of how it all nets out. But there'll definitely be some decrease from the homeless support that was already very controversial and advocates were saying is way too low. And that's if the legislature goes for these new funding streams, which they've already rejected before. So I guess if you're looking at what McKee is trying to do to solve the homelessness problem, to give him credit that he's proposing these new fully state-backed revenue sources to try to help the problem. But it's not going to be as much as we are getting through federal money, and they might be cut out by the legislature anyway. So it kind of puts everything back where it was, or back up in the air of how much is actually going to be available. And then you have the speaker saying that actually it's not an issue of money, it's of execution and actually providing the services in an effective way rather than the number of dollars.
Is that a shot at the governor's office?
Oh, it was. I mean, Patrick and I were in the scrum with the speaker after the State of the State, and I asked Shikarchi up top, said the governor said, I put an idea in my budget last year and you guys didn't do it for homelessness. And Shikarchi was like, that's not true. That's not right. He said he agreed that they didn't do the tax he wanted, but he said there's tons of money. And then I saw the speaker's office tweet out later in the week, clearly trying to buttress their case, a laundry list of money they've poured into homelessness efforts. And they argue it's just the executive branch and the new housing department and whoever else is involved just are not able to execute even when the legislature puts up money. And frankly, that's something Senate President Ruggiero has been complaining about basically since the housing department began. I think he said it to you guys.
Yeah, this has really been the biggest split I've seen between the General Assembly leaders and McKee since he's been in office.
Yeah, the speaker in his own speech on the day that he was sworn in as speaker had a dig at the state housing department and how he was disappointed in their performance, and the governor was sitting right in front of him there in the audience. And so that's not really something we've seen in the past. They've seemed to all try to get along, at least in public, and maybe they fight behind the scenes.
And I know the governor's aides have a somewhat nervous eye on the Senate's called this oversight hearing to look at how they're dealing with homelessness, to show that they're taking an eye on it. Don't forget the new housing secretary, Deborah Goddard, she's not even confirmed yet. She's still an acting secretary. So it seems like it's going to get grilled in an oversight hearing by the same Senate that hasn't even decided yet whether to give her the job. So It's just a very messy situation.
And there are going to be oversight hearings on the Washington Bridge
and
the cyber attack
Yep.
coming up. So plenty of opportunity.
Must not be an election year if they want to do this much oversight.
All right, Ted, before we go to break, I want to play a little bit of sound, if I could, and we're going to pivot briefly from the state budget, because I really wanted to talk about this. Senator Reid, ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, he made national headlines with his comments to President-elect Trump's pick to run the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Let's take a listen.
The Secretary is expected to be a fair, nonpartisan, and responsible leader, as well as a trustworthy advocate for the men and women that he leads. Mr. Hegseth, I do not believe that you are qualified to meet the overwhelming demands of this job.
Ted, we've covered Senator Reid for a long time. He is not a fire and brimstone U.S. Senator by no means, but for him, that was blistering.
Yeah, sometimes when the Washington reporters write about Reid, it sounds like his first name is normally taciturn Senator Jack Reid. Like they always put a phrase like that in, because that is, the way he seems to all of us up here in Rhode Island is how he seems to people in Washington. And it was clearly very striking to Capitol Hill. Forget what we all thought up here as his constituents in Rhode Island, that Reid. He didn't dance around, I have real concerns, Mr. Hegseth, or I'm really worried about this. He just said, you are not qualified to do this job. Yeah. And I'm saying that with the authority I've built up over 36 years on Capitol Hill as a veteran myself, a military expert, et cetera.
And he pointed out that he voted for the 9 previous,
including Trump's
first.
Yeah,
and just, I cover Jack Reid very closely, and I have for a long time, and I know how he ticks and how he thinks. And he has always very much wanted to preserve, whoever is at the administration, Republican or Democrat, good working relationships with Pentagon leadership. He sees that as part of his job as the top Democrat on those issues. So for him to torch, frankly, the guy who's almost certainly going to get confirmed anyway, just shows Reid decided this was beyond the pale, even though I'm sure he knows he's damaging his ability to be effective with the Pentagon for some period of time.
All right, we're going to take a break here on Newsmakers. When we come back, the governor's state of the state and what it might tell us about his re-election efforts. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Ted Nesi, a reporter's roundtable with Patrick Anderson from the Providence Journal and Steph Machado from the Boston Globe. Let's talk about the governor's state of the state speech, which was ahead of the budget proposal. This was on Tuesday night. It clocked in at over an hour. It was a lengthy speech, to say the least, and it was somewhat overshadowed by tension with protesters in the rotunda of the State House that were ultimately pushed out, and then the governor's office announced that they weren't going to allow broadcast photojournalists into the chambers for the speech. Steph wrote a lot about that in the Boston Globe if you want to check that out, more details there. Overall, the whole night, either the governor's speech or everything that surrounded it, what were generally, Patrick, we'll start with you, what were your takeaways about the state of the state?
Well, it's a little tough for McKee. He doesn't have the kind of relationship with lawmakers and the people in that room generally that some other people do. So he kind of walks in there with a little bit of a headwind. And as the speech went on and on and on, and you could hear the protesters outside, which he obviously took extreme measures to try to prevent being able to hear them, there was a kind of tense vibe in the chamber and in the room. And then especially as it went after 8 o'clock and it got kind of longer and longer and longer than your average State of the State speech, and you saw the governor asking for applause, which never looks great. Right. It wasn't the kind of uplifting enter a re-election cycle I think that you would want as a governor seeking re-election.
Yeah, and the speech's content didn't necessarily make a lot of news. There weren't a lot of surprises, and so that's why the thing that people were talking about the next day was the blocking of the protesters from the rotunda and the situation with preventing news cameras in the chamber, which he has now said they're going to go back to normal next year. But I've been trying to do some reporting this week about the rotunda reservation situation, and I can get really no answers from the Department of Administration about, can protesters reserve the rotunda? Can they reserve it for 5.5 hours?
They've not given you, because I've wondered that too.
All they said is the governor reserved the rotunda for the state of the state. That's just the same line that they keep repeating. And I keep saying, well, so can protesters reserve it as well? Can they reserve it for 5.5 hours as the governor had it?
You interviewed Professor Dean Logan, former, now retired at the Roger Williams
Ed
law
did.
school. Ed did. Okay, but in your article, your byline was on it. And, there is constitutional law, like that's a limited public forum, and the government can put time, place, and manner restrictions on it. So when push comes to shove.
I think it's less of a constitutional issue and more of it just looks bad, right?
Yes.
You don't let people protest in the spot where everyone always protests, and you shove them into the corner so that you can't hear them as well. It's a bad look.
Yeah, oddly, by pushing the protesters away, I guess if they were in the rotunda yelling, maybe it would have been louder in the speech, which would have been more, you can't do the hypothetical. But in a way, they still had the problem they clearly seemed to fear, which was protests overshadowing the speech, at least in part. It still did partly overshadow the speech.
Lose in many ways. All right, a couple minutes left here. I do want to touch on, as we were walking on set here, the new numbers came out from Morning Consult. They poll governors in all 50 states, and it puts Governor Dan McKee's approval rating to wrap up 2024, right? It was at the tail end of 24? Okay. 44% approval, 40% disapproval, the worst in New England and maybe in the country. But on the flip side, McKee's campaign spokesperson had a different take on it. Yeah,
Mike Traynor, who's the governor's longtime spokesman, put out a campaign statement this morning, just as we were coming on the air, saying, see, this shows he is far from, dead in the water, that my word's not his, and, shows he can run, and if he's at 44 with the general public, that means he's probably in better shape with Democratic primary voters. And they are clearly, they really seem to understand, as 2025 kicks off, their first job is to convince the political class and, frankly, reporters he's definitely running. He's not stepping aside. We all have Lincoln Chafee in 2013 in our heads when he was running until he wasn't.
Yeah.
And so they want to make clear to the Shekarchis of the world, to labor leaders and others who might be looking at a second option. Helena Foulkes is running no matter what, but others who might try to step into a void created by McKee, they're like, there's going to be a void, and he has a path. So it's interesting. I want to see, Morning Consult has a different methodology. I'm not saying the poll is wrong. I'm just saying I'd like to see a new UNH poll as well, maybe a new Salve poll if they poll in the coming months to get some more cross-checks of this data. But I understand where the governor's office would tout it.
Well, and also I would think recent headlines on Helena Foulkes and the lawsuit that the Department of Justice brought against CBS when she was the head of retail probably gave, you said headwind walking into the chambers, probably gave Governor Dan McKee some tailwind about thinking about re-election in 26.
Yeah, they are really trying to keep that in the news, that lawsuit. I mean, that poll kind of glass half full, glass half full. It's better than his 30s in Morning Consult. Glass half empty. He's still lower in New England and below Kathy Hochul in New York. So it's a balancing. The interesting other thing is that they brought up Gina Raimondo in that campaign response as if they're now running. Is McKee running against Gina Raimondo's legacy? He hasn't before, but maybe that's where he's going. I don't know.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you all for joining us on this roundtable. Complete right through of the budget on WPRI.com. Ted has it all there for you with what you need to know. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. Thanks to Patrick Anderson and Steph Machado. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.